Okay, and we are live. I'm just fixing my camera here. I was telling Orlee off camera that I have Orlee tucked in my little dining room table candelabra. I'm going to pull up the chat really quick, and then we're going to get into some questions. So we're going to start talking about the Djinn and some demons and some philosophy and some left-hand path kikis. So go ahead, grab yourself a cocktail, a tea, a beverage, have a smoke, do whatever you need. Make yourself cozy, make yourself comfortable, okay? So let me pull this chat up. Hold, please. Orlee, will you kind of introduce yourself for, some of my subscribers who may or may not already be familiar with you?
Sure. So, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am an artist, and I'm interested in all the mysteries of this reality and exploring it through art and through creative works in general. So in particular, I really enjoy video art. So I have a YouTube channel, which is just my name, Orlee Stewart. And over the years, I've been using this channel as my magical diary. So I'm very interested in the paranormal, in the supernatural, in the dark side, but also in everything in general when it comes to witchcraft and magic and all the mysteries in the darkness. I am a writer, so I have written in a lot of different books. I have my own book about the Goetia that you can find on Amazon. And I also do a lot of work with various different currents, in particular working with the spirits of the dead, and just allowing the spirits to work with me creatively in whatever manner is fitting to communicate that message. So I also really love painting, and I create works of art that can be worked with as portals to spirits in ritual practice. And I have a lot of experience with ceremonial magic. Over the years of my studies, I've been a part of many different magical orders. I served as a priestess in the OTO for a number of years, and I also started teaching people about magic in different magical orders as well. And then it turned into me doing that on YouTube. So yeah, I guess that's basically it.
And I'm so stoked that when I sent Orlee a message, I was like, hey, can we please talk about this, and can we please do a live? Orlee got back with me right away, you guys. And I'm so stoked that we're going to be able to have this conversation. So Orlee, how would you say, you would identify yourself? Do you use the label of magician or witch, or, what label would you use if you had to? And I know that labels are kind of annoying sometimes, but if you had to pick one to kind of identify your practice so people kind of know, because labels make things comfortable where we can put all these things in little boxes.
For sure. So I definitely would call myself a witch because I don't follow any one particular system of magic or system of beliefs. And I'm really interested in connecting to the spirits of nature in general and the old ways.
Would you also define your religious or philosophical kind of label also as witch, or are there other labels that you feel like you also would use to define your orthodoxy?
Sure. So that's an interesting question. I used to say that I was a Thelemite or a Satanist, but now I don't like to define myself as anything in particular because I'm really seeing things from different paradigms now and incorporating all the different elements of the universe. So even if it's something like black magic or white magic, what have you, I like to consider myself to be gray in combination of all the things in existence.
So would you say then that you would just not label yourself, or
yeah exactly,
or that you're just a witch first? You're a witch first.
I would say I'm a witch first, and I think that David Bowie said this in an interview once, and it always resonated with me, which is that he just likes magic, and that's the religion that he follows.
So what like, what age do you think you were when you first kind of started coming into this and really having an interest in the esoteric, the metaphysical, the occult? Maybe not what age you were when you started defining yourself as a witch, but when do you think you started to become interested?
I started having a lot of really strong paranormal experiences that I actually had the power to do research into by the point when I was like, I guess 15 is when it started, and I started doing all the research because I suddenly had access to the internet on a laptop and could look things up and start searching for things, because it was never something that I had any access to in my immediate life around me. When I was in high school, I had met some people that were into Wicca, but it never really resonated with me because it just wasn't connected to the things that I was experiencing, which were quite terrifying. And I wanted to gain control over my reality and conquer my fears by learning how to perform magic to basically protect myself.
Mm-hmm. What age do you think you were?
I think I was like 16 or 15 years old.
15 or 16? Okay.
Yeah.
And what age would you say that you started really taking this more seriously and like started verbally identifying with the label of witch?
When I was 18, I started being active in the OTO when I lived in Toronto, Canada, and attending classes on magic and tarot and astrology, and participating in group rites with other people and studying it very, very seriously.
Do you still practice magic and observe ritual in a group setting today, or would you consider yourself to be more of a solitary practitioner?
So I do things with other people in a couple of different ways. I'm solitary in the sense that it will always come down to my own personal path in general, because that is completely uniquely my own. But the majority of my work I do with my girlfriend Yuri, because we do daily work together, and we do a lot of really intense rituals and magical operations on an ongoing basis, like tons of different experiments and various things. It's a huge aspect of our life. So every day we're doing some kind of magic together. So there's that aspect. And then I also do some things in conjunction with other people over the internet now, which is quite fun. But aside from that, the only other things that I've done with other people were particular rights, but over the past couple of years, it's all just been over the internet, not actually in person with other people.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like you value, your intimate practice with your partner, and you feel like, that closeness and that intimacy that you guys share brings something different than, let's say, maybe how you might practice with a group of people in the physical realm?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because of the type of group rituals I was so heavily involved in, which, for example, were um, solar phallic rituals. So, for example, the OTO's central ritual is called the Gnostic Mass, and the priestess typically at a certain point is nude as part of the ceremony, because the idea is we are working with that current beyond the basic understanding of it and turning it into something sacred through the rite where it becomes part of God. So that's a very intimate ritual. And I spent a huge part of my life studying that and those particular mysteries. And I reached a point where it totally helped me, and I'm super grateful for those experiences, but it just became something that I didn't need to do anymore. And those things changed for me, and I became more oriented toward my own personal practice. And it is something that is super, super sacred to me. And I also feel like magic is something that is so intense that you need to do it with someone that you really, really trust.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that I also grew to know from just being in different orders and doing with other people, there is such a great benefit in doing rites with other people in a group. Like, that's totally awesome. And I do still enjoy doing that. It's just that now that the internet has come, we can have rites with other people online, like all over the world simultaneously, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I definitely would say that the magical partnership that I have with Yuri is something that I value more than doing something with like a big group of people, because it has that sacred divine nature of love as a huge central aspect of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I have been a solitary practitioner. I'm in a coven now, and I still have a solitary practice while I'm in the coven. But even before the coven, I had, participated in some group rituals that, the community had just kind of thrown together. And I definitely think that when there is some sort of connection, be it romantic or sexual or even just like platonic love, you know what I mean? I think that sort of genuine, heartfelt connection to me really makes that magic so much stronger and easier to wield as a group, because there is that trust and there is that connection. And like, I wouldn't trade it for the world. While I love my solitary practice and I still practice solo, I also, practicing a group or practicing in a coven, I think also is so beneficial too. And I'm thankful that I'm able to have both,
Yes, because especially when we reach a certain place in our trajectory of evolution spiritually, it can really help to then work with other people, because your power is then combining together into something new.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit earlier about the Gnostic Mass and connecting to God. What is your interpretation of God? Would you consider yourself to be like a monotheist, an atheist, a non-theist, a polytheist, a duotheist? Are there any labels in terms of theism that you feel like you identify with?
That's a really good question. I don't think I can put any particular label on it, because I like to see it as we ourselves are God. So everything is coming from us in our own subjective reality that's connecting with other people's objective realities. I do feel like there are other entities and preternatural intelligences. I've experienced them. So that's also the case. Yet in a magical, mystical way, all these things are also intertwined with our own self.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I hear,
Yeah.
I had another left-hand path witch actually on my podcast as the Cauldron Bubbles the other day. And it was so interesting to me because she was kind of talking about her connection with demons and her connection working with demons. And, she considers herself to be someone who is non-theistic. So she doesn't necessarily have a disbelief in deity. It's just not a part of her practice. And when I interviewed her more, and there's no wrong answers, like I am of the opinion that there are so many paths to truth. And while we might agree or disagree, like, it doesn't really change the validity of someone's belief, because I'm very much of the opinion that there is so much power in belief and so much truth in belief, and that there's multiple roads to the same destination. It was kind of interesting to me because she is kind of echoing what you mentioned about entities, and how she, believes that demons and entities are literal and sentient beings that are external forces that she works with. But when it comes to gods, whether it be Abrahamic gods or pagan gods or eldritch or whatever, there's an idea that that's more archetypal. So I think that disconnection there, well, I won't say it's a disconnection. I will say when I look at it, it seems like a disconnection to me, because what makes entities separate than divinities? What would you say? What do you think the difference is between something that is, a deity and something that is an entity? How would you define the difference there?
Well, sure. So I definitely think that in the ecosystem of the paranormal, there are different kinds and types and ranks of spirits, we can see this and test it when it comes to ceremonial magic in regards to there are certain entities where it's very easy for them to come to us and others where it requires a whole bunch of work and different magical items and ceremonies and things. So that is a factor. But what deifies something is the attention and energy that's given to it by humans, by humanity. So the entities that voices have been stronger and have connected to people and reached out through their own power, those are the ones that over time have become these gods for many ancient cultures. And thus, through control and colonialization, things become demons. But there's also those darker aspects as well. But all of them are part of the greater whole. And if you want to think about the concept of God, all those things are part of it. And my practice is extremely open-minded. So conventionally, for like an outsider, it would be easy to label me as a Satanist because I do a lot of work with Satan. I do a lot of work with demons, and I'm really into that stuff. But I also do other kinds of magic. So, for example, Yuri is a Catholic priest, and we do a lot of work for the spirits of the dead, involving more traditional prayers from other cultures that follow that system of magic, the magical aspect of it. And I get a lot out of doing those practices, and they work. So I think that it's very difficult for me to really define myself and my practice. It's easy for people to focus on the darker aspects of it, but I also find that if we only focus on one thing, then we can become very unbalanced. So that's something that I always try to rectify in my practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too that when I was talking to her, and like I said too, I don't believe when it comes to spirituality and our orthodoxy, I don't really believe that while you or I might disagree, I don't really believe that an orthodoxy is wrong because that's someone's belief system. And who am I to say that your belief is inaccurate? Because I don't think that's a thing. But, I do think that when I was talking to her on the episode, it was interesting because she was kind of saying how, kind of a little bit like what you were saying, where she believes that deities are the thing that separates deities and entities is that deities, there is some sort of act of subservience or worship with deity. And versus entities, it's more of a working relationship where it's not necessarily worshiping. Would you also agree with this separation between entities and deities or no?
I agree, and I also disagree because when it comes to working with a deity, we don't necessarily have to worship them in order to work with them. However, they do receive a more elevated status by how other people have treated them, essentially. And that's also how we can find certain spirits are more angry because they have been ignored and forgotten about.
Yeah, I feel like I am a witch as well who works with, I guess, what we might consider to be entities, though I have never really used that word. And I'm also a witch who works with deities, and deities is a big part of my orthodoxy. However, I feel like I've never worshipped any sort of god or goddess. And while I might hold reverence to them, I don't feel like there's really worship as a part of my practice per se. I also think too that in terms of deity, I'm very much of the kind of belief and opinion that I would consider myself personally to be more of a soft polytheist. I believe in multiple forms of divinity and also spirits that are not divine. And I guess how I separate that or make that make sense in my mind is, to me, divinity is something that is more cosmic and more universal energy. And I believe in a divine source, and that all of these gods, if you will, are just different names of frequencies of energy. So different cultures around the world separated by linguistic or cultural or geographic barriers are all working with this universal force energy of war or of love or of hatred or of beauty or of harvest, right? And like there's different names for this energy. And I think that like what you were saying, I'm very much of the opinion, and this whole like as above, so below, as the gods, so are we. We are living incarnations of the faces of God. And I think in a way, everything is connected because I consider myself to be more of a soft polytheist in the sense that all divine energy comes from one source that is pure chaos and is not necessarily sentient. And then I think that us as human beings have projected our own personalities onto this energy, given it names, given it life force, and then thus almost like created a super powerful version of an egregore. That's kind of how I see it. And then entities to me is more like spirits of the land, or, and I might change my opinion after talking to you more about demons. I might change some of my opinions on demonology because I don't know a lot about demons. And that's part of why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I definitely think that, when it comes to demonology, you have a lot of great content. And so for anyone watching who's like interested in Satanism and demons, I highly recommend checking out Orlee's channel because there's so much cool stuff on there. And I was telling Orlee before we actually started that the first video I found was actually a video about working with the algorithms. And I was like, what is this? Like, this is so, I'd never heard of that before. It was totally new to me.
It was a totally animistic approach where I'm saying that we can invoke the internet, basically. That was the idea. And it was an experiment. Like, I didn't do it just to make a cringy YouTube video. I mean, that was part of the art of the actual event, the happening of it. Like, I knew
Orlee, I loved it.
Thank you. It was one of those things where it needed to be like that because it was of what it was for, which is the idea of taking on that essence of what is the internet and YouTube and everything, and making a ritual to invoke that into myself as an experiment. And then it was super meta because I'm using videos as part of the video, and then it's also on the channel. So like, that was a very fun thing that I did. And I definitely feel like it was successful because after that, I now have an entire career that spans from doing this on the internet. So it's pretty fantastic. And I definitely want to get into talking about demons more. Before we do though, I do want to say that, like, because we were talking a bit about the idea of worship, I do feel like worship can be something that is very beautiful. And for those people that enjoy it, they can get a lot out of it. Like, I would definitely say that I worship Santa Morte. I worship death as the highest and greatest entity and force and deity, all the things.
And I guess how would you define worship then? Because I think that for a lot of us witches, worship can take on different meanings. When I initially think of worship, I think of like full prostration, full subservience to whatever X might be.
Sure. And well, the thing about her is that she's not like one of those spirits that's going to go make you do something. It's death. So death is already here. It's already something. It's already the meaning of our life. Everything we do is for death. So to be subservient, really all one has to do is live. And so that's the idea. And it's basically uniting yourself with this current of power through respecting it. And I like to approach her like she is my mother that I love. And so that's the way that I see that relationship. But it's very complicated, and I definitely, like, it's not in the same kind of way that one would easily find it in like a traditional religion. When you define worship, like, it's still very, very much witchcraft in the way that I do things. But I do believe in like, going before her on my knees in prayer. when I'm working with her. And the way that I work with her is like not the same as I work with the demons, which is we are approaching the demons to contact them and to approach them from a place of power where we can ask them to do things to help us instead of praying for something.
So when did you start really getting into, should we call it demonology? When did you start getting into that?
2013 is when I first started. I had already been practicing ceremonial magic for quite some time, and I learned it as part of one of the magical orders I was in. But the person who was teaching me it was also very into the black magic perspective of it. So the system that I learned demon summoning through is called the Ars Goetia. It's from the Lemegeton, which is also called the Lesser Key of Solomon. And
I'm very familiar with Solomon.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what I think is very interesting about all of this, especially because we can trace a lot of these sources back to the Babylonian exile, for example, like where these cultures connect. So it's very interesting. And so that was the system that I learned it from. And now there's older texts, but this is just what I was doing and what I learned because it was part of Aleister Crowley's teaching methods of how to learn magic following a certain system for his inner order. And so anyway, I learned how to summon demons following this formula, but the traditional formula in the Goetia is one that is very much rooted in like Judeo-Christianity, in the prayers that you use, in the attitude that you have, in the way the ceremony is set up, and in the regalia and what have you. And so even when I was learning it, it was still being taught to me in a kind of punk rock approach, I guess we could call it, where my teacher would have like a beer in the magical circle, or like it wouldn't be like the way that you would think someone performing these rites would do it, because of the attitude toward these demons are not something to be afraid of. They are something that are our helpers, and we can learn from them and approach them like they're your friend. And it turned into this very interesting path for me of learning that these entities are far more than what these grimoires say. And I, years later, wrote my own book on the Ars Goetia for the Black Magician, which takes the essential formula from the Goetia and uses the things that are necessary to contact these extremely powerful entities. So things like lunations, the time, the elements that you're using in the metals, and things of that nature. Parts of the formula that really are quite essential for contacting these particular spirits, because, I mean, these are incredibly powerful entities. And you want to make sure that you're contacting the right spirit, not some kind of trickster spirit, and that these things are going to go well for you. So through many years of trial and error, I've experimented with it to figure out like what aspects of the ceremony do you actually need to work with to contact these spirits, like what works and what doesn't, what went really badly, and then what other things are added in. And I put this book together that teaches you it in that formula. And then I created my own versions of all the invocations and conjurations that are aligned to the dark goddess and yourself being God as the ritual formula.
So what is kind of your opinion of like the lesser and greater keys then of Solomon? Like in terms of the story of Solomon, or like, what do you think about that? Because now we're really getting into what I really want to talk to you about.
Oh, absolutely. So I definitely like to entertain the idea that those legends are true. And we can know this by the fact that we can summon these demons and contact them. So clearly it came from somewhere. And it's possible that not every single one of these grimoires actually came from Solomon because of how long ago that was, and people could have just attributed it to him. because it would give it some validity. But I definitely feel like it's a legitimate thing to go for when you're working with this, is to entertain the idea that even he himself like becomes an egregor that you can tap into. And we know by the fact that these systems work that there is truth to it in some kind of way, to the extent that it doesn't really matter if Solomon was real or not. These entities certainly are. And if we follow these directions, it works. And there's a reason why these books were once so like, coveted and protected and guarded.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that whether Solomon or Salimit was, a man incarnated in the flesh, or some other sort of spirit incarnated in the flesh, or whether Salimit was the author of these books, at this point, for me personally, is irrelevant, because the power is still there regardless.
Yeah.
So what is your sort of religious background? I think you mentioned a little bit earlier that your mother's side of your family is Jewish.
Yeah, absolutely. So my religious background is that I grew up in a very religious Jewish household, and I went to a religious school up until I was in middle school. And my dad's side of the family is from Malta, and they're Catholic. So I experienced some elements of Catholicism growing up, not very much so, because it was very much like we're doing Judaism as the family religion. So that was my whole experience. And in that tradition, in that religion, we were taught that Solomon was a real person. So it was easy for me to slip into that paradigm of believing it. Even though like I completely rebelled against the religion of my family, to their disdain, of course, but they still love me because I'm not a terrible person, so that's nice. Yeah, so it definitely made me curious about these things, but especially being a woman, they don't really like talk to you about the super mystical, occult aspects.
Right, because as a woman, like, your brain just couldn't handle it.
Right. Yeah.
Our brains just can't handle the El Kadib. Our brains can't handle the hidden mysteries. No. Nay. We're supposed to be in the kitchen. Like, that's what we're supposed to do. Not stressing about life's inner mysteries, of course.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So that too was, even just like getting into the occult was part of my rebellion, even greater, because it's like, as a woman, you're not even supposed to do that. Not only is it like against the traditions of what you're supposed to do, but yeah.
So do you have anyone in your family who, like, in some way or form practices what you might consider to be witchcraft, even if they do not?
Well, yeah, my dad used to be a Freemason, and
Okay.
that's all he told me. So I don't know like what he actually did, but I know that. And then he also told me about how my great grandmother in Malta used to see ghosts all the time.
Yeah. So would you say that your dad probably wouldn't consider himself like a witch, but
I don't know.
You don't know?
He definitely wouldn't tell anyone if he did.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
I definitely feel like I have folks in my family who, like, in my opinion, very much practice witchcraft, but like they would never call it that. You know what I mean? Like, that would be like so blasphemous to call it witchcraft. But in my opinion, like, divination is a form of witchcraft. So like, if you're practicing divination, that's kind of witchy. Like, if you're drawing up a natal chart to figure out when, this wedding should be planned, that's kind of witchy to me.
For sure. For sure.
Like, so what is your take, and you are someone who also considers himself to walk like the left-hand path, correct?
Yeah, I would say that.
So what is your opinion or take on Djinn?
Well, I've never worked with the Djinn to have an opinion about this, first of
Okay.
all.
Yeah.
So that's very important to know. And that's why I was excited to talk to you about this, because what I've read from other occultists' experiences, they sound very similar
Yeah.
to these entities from the Goetia.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting too. And that's why I'm excited to talk to you about this as well. Because I feel like we're kind of coming from, you know, the same street, but two different, you know, sides of the same street. And we're meeting halfway kind of at this liminal crossroads space through the internet, which is so beautiful. Because I don't know a lot about demons. Like I know a little bit, and I have friends and loved ones who I've connected with in the physical and the digital, who that is part of their practice. But for me, when it comes to demonology, it's very much like I am working on, if we're going to talk about like 4 powers of the Magi, I'm very much working on my to know. I'm very much working on understanding how I fit demons into my orthodoxy. Because religiously, I would consider myself, same kind of like what you were saying, like I consider myself to be a witch first. But if I had to pick a religious label, you know, I wouldn't necessarily identify as Muslim. I would identify more so as like a pagan or a follower of earth-based faiths or a kafir, which is so funny because some of the videos that I've made about Djinn or about Arabian style magic, I get a lot of my brothers and sisters, right? Like in Allah and God, who come onto my page warning me, you know, about the kafir, warning me about being an unbeliever, warning me about the sacrilege that I'm doing. Like they're informing me, like I don't know that I'm practicing sihr, which is Arabic for essentially like black magic. But like, it's funny because that's the whole point of my channel. So like they come onto my channel and leave these comments like, oh no, sister, like, you know, turn to God and da, 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 da. And it's like, no, but that's the point, is that I'm an unbeliever. Like,
right. Yeah, it's very interesting. One thing that we can look at when we're trying to figure out what these entities really are is that when we look at the Goetia, for example, and there's different rankings of the demons. So they have kings, and then there's dukes, there's princes, there's a whole bunch of different ones. And each different one has different times that you're supposed to summon them, times of day or conditions of weather. And they also have different metals that are attributed to them that you use to summon them. So like for the kings, for example, they're the sun, and so their metal's gold. And so you are to make their seal out of gold. And those are summoned on the high occasions. So like solstices, equinoxes, what have you, other high occasions. But so there's those aspects where it seems like we can find a planetary connection to these entities based on those aspects. But there is something that is just so very ancient about them that goes like beyond this reality, I guess is the best way of trying to wrap our heads around it. Like they're not just connected to this world. They're quite possibly part of some whole different world that is in conjunction with ours in some kind of way. I know another thing that's probably interesting is the idea of the magical lamp. So in the Goetia, according to the formula of the grimoire, this is not something that I, like as a black magician, practice, but if you follow the traditional formula of the lesser key, there is a vessel of brass with the secret seal of Solomon that goes on it. And so that's what you're supposed to use to contain the seals of your different demons. So it's like the same idea of the magical lamp, because that's could also be made of brass. So I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I was gonna say that to me kind of sounds like sihr. That to me kind of sounds like Indian style magic when you're talking about using a vessel for a spirit specifically as a lamp.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I'm familiar with kind of this like almost hierarchy system where you have like kings and dukes and earls of hell or demons, right? And like they have different rankings and are in control of different
Yeah, and then they all have like scores of thousands of legions below them that they command.
And I don't necessarily feel like, you know, with Djinn, we have that same sort of idea or like construct. Like it's not really like there's like King Djinn or anything that rule legions of other Djinn. And I think that while I don't consider myself to be Abrahamic, I think that if you look at, you know, a lot of lore about Djinn or mythology about Djinn, looking at the Quran, we have humans who are essentially made from clay. And at the same time, mortal human beings are created within the Quran. The Djinn are created from smokeless fire. And Djinn and humans are both equally mortal and have free will, complete free will. So the idea is that Djinn are very similar to people, but they're more almost like astral in a way than physical. And they have relationships and get married and have babies and live a halal or a haram life. Some of them become believers, some of them become disbelievers, just like humans. But in the Quran, and I'm not as familiar with other holy Abrahamic texts, but in the Quran, there is also a mention of demons, which is completely separate than Djinn in the Quran. So, you know, demons are made from darkness and are essentially subservient to shaitan, subservient to Satan. And there's different types of Djinn, and a type of Djinn would be the shayateen, which those would be Satan's Djinn.
Interesting.
But other types of Djinn, like the Afrit or the Hun, aren't necessarily connected in any way to shaitan or the idea of Satan. And then there's also angels that are mentioned. So we basically have like 4 main types of living, breathing, sentient forces that are not God. And that would be angels made of light, demons made of darkness. Interestingly, in the Quran, though, angels actually don't have free will, and they're named after like different types of messengers, essentially, and they do not have any free will whatsoever, and they are completely subservient to Allah, to God, Allah Akbar, right? They're completely subservient to God. Demons, it's kind of in the Quran. I'm not saying this is necessarily 100% what I believe, but I'm saying if I was to look at this from an Islamic or a Quranic perspective, like demons also don't necessarily have free will and are completely subservient to shaitan, Satan. And then we have humans and we have Djinn, which are kind of like the other side of the coin, where humans and Djinn do have free will and they can do with their lives what they choose to. And then within kind of this overarching house of Djinn, you have different sorts of Djinn. Like you have like gulas, which essentially live in unclean spaces. So like restrooms or city dumpsters or grungy nightclubs where there's like vomit on the floor, or graveyards. And there's tons of stories about gulas in Arabian lore. And then the Hun are more animalistic. So for example, you might have, you know, typically crows are in a flock of a murder of crows where there's a whole group of them. But let's say there was one where they're not connected to a flock, or if you see an animal that almost is not exhibiting traditionally that species behavior, then it could be a belief that it's more like a Hun. And then the shayateen would be more like Satan's Djinn, which from a Quranic perspective would have, you know, more baneful intentions for you than maybe other types of Djinn, or at best, more of a trickster sort of energy. Like they want to beguile you, to fool you. But Djinn overall, and I've talked about this before with like druids before who work with the Fae. And I don't know if I feel comfortable saying that Djinn are Fae, but I think that we still have this same sense of like neutrality.
I can totally see that, and it makes a lot of sense to me, and I like those categories. of a breakdown, because I definitely think that the term demon is extremely broad. And we have things like the demons in these grimoires that have these systems to evoke them. And then there's other entities that people would call demonic, like other like lower vibrational entities, or even natural spirits. Really, all these things get labeled as demonic because people are afraid of them and they don't understand it. And so that's the idea of how I like to approach my study of demonology, to all the things that people who are afraid, what are they afraid of, and to figure out that. But I totally do see what you mean, where even in this category, as we could call it, demons, it's very, very likely that a large group of them in many grimoires are going to be entities that are a crossover from other cultures that have been renamed in order to take those entities away from them, to make them into something evil. So that's a huge aspect of it. Like, a huge aspect of learning about demons is figuring out what they really are and where they really came from. And because not all of them are nefarious in nature, most of them have very, very helpful qualities. And we can even find things like, for example, in the Greater Key of Solomon, where it's angelic and planetary spirits. There's no demons in there, but they're in certain places referred to as demons in this book of angels. And so we can see that it's a failure in the wording and an attempt of categorizing things very, very broadly. So I definitely think that there is an overlap among these systems and terminologies, but just the term demon in itself, I like it because it makes people understand that I'm going to go where people are afraid to go. But there's also very much so entities that have the qualities that are exactly as you were describing, and I've experienced them. And I do feel like, as you're saying with the Djinn, they do seem like more nature oriented, where we do have like the wandering dead and the hungry ghosts. There are so many different types of spirits that just labeling things as just one thing or another thing, it really puts limits on it.
Right. And well, I think too that, like, you know, talking about the creation or the origin story of Djinn, we are talking about something that is made from literal fire that has no smoke, right? So like we are in a way kind of talking about like an elemental.
Yeah,
So
I can
that's
see
why I
that.
feel like that's why I feel like they're kind of more earth nature based sort of.
Yeah, and like the process of how they're contacted, I would say, says a lot about it as well. And we can find that too, like within the Goetia, because we're using these metals, these elements, to contact them as well. So I think there is that aspect of them that is very elemental. But yeah, it's very interesting.
Well, and something that I think is interesting is that, like, I was talking to another Sahir practitioner of the left hand, and you know, she studies demonology as well, and she practices, like I said, Sahir, and she's of the opinion that these quote unquote demons are actually Middle Eastern gods. What is your kind of take on that?
I could totally see that, especially because in the research that I've done of tracing the origins of the Goetia for when I wrote my book, it's very likely that that's where these entities originated from. I mean, for one, if their names are their actual names of origin, they all sound like Hebraic angelic names, like most of them do. And so there's that aspect of it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about it either. I mean, I think it's an interesting opinion. You know what I mean? And I think it's like something that I've really put some serious thought into it, in terms of kind of sorting out my own orthodoxy. You know, are these demons actually gods?
I had a teacher who told me something on this note, which was like, they go insane because people have turned them into something horrible and have forgotten about them. And so you can even have an entity that was once very, very kind go insane from its treatment, because these are unique personalities. And I figured this out from my studies and from experiencing it with other people, where we're contacting the same entity in our own unique spaces and ways and receiving the same kinds of information and gnosis from them. And that was something that was really cool that came through this gigantic project that we're just wrapping up now in Become a Living God. So like a lot of the entities that we have been working with over the past 3 years are entities from the Goetia. They're these demonic entities. We've been working with the demonic gatekeepers. So this is the most recent one that was released. This is Asmodeus, the Lord of Lust. But we do have one on Satan that's coming out on December 29th from Become a Living God. But anyway, I've been doing the magical working with these different entities, and so have all these other people. And we have all found that not only do they give us similar experiences to one another, but that those practitioners who have experience in other magical cultures, like with the Djinn, have found that they overlap with their own experiences with these spirits too. So I think it's definitely worth checking out as well, because there's a lot of crossover, but it's one of those things where, like, if we're not experienced in all these traditions, we are missing out on understanding the parallels that are right in front of us.
Yeah, and something that I think is very interesting here in like the West is, you know, a lot of Western people who are not into the occult or are not educated within occultism don't necessarily know what Djinn are. Versus if I, you know, was in Walmart and I walk up to a random person at Walmart and I'm like, oh, do you know what a demon is? Like, they might have an opinion.
Right.
Versus if I walk up to a random person at Walmart and say, do you know what a Djinn is? They might be they might not even know what I'm talking about. And I think something else interesting found in more like urban legends, not necessarily mythology, but maybe urban legends or folklore here in the States. And I don't know if this overlaps also with demons, if you feel like it would or wouldn't, but I do feel like there's a little bit of overlap with Djinn, where here in the Western world, you know, in the States or even in Europe, when I talk to some of my European friends, like there is this concept of shadow people, right? Notoriously one of them being like the top hat man, like, and tons of people in the Western world have this experience with this shadow person or this shadowy figure that terrifies them as a young child or causes essentially like sleep paralysis. And typically they're described as a, you know, the silhouette of a person, but they are almost like a complete void, like they're filled with shadow. And I think that is so interesting because there is verses in the Quran that talk about a jinn's physical form is that of exactly pretty much that, because they are smokeless fire. So they typically appear as just like a dark mass, or like if you look at photos allegedly of jinn, which jinn could appear as animals, jinn could appear as physical people like you and I. Like you could have a strange encounter at like a gas station or a train station or the supermarket, and like, you know, I could be talking to you right now as a Djinn and you may or may well not know, right? Like that's kind of the idea. But the true form, quote unquote, is essentially like a black shadowy mass, which kind of overlaps with this belief or this idea of shadow people. So like, what do you think of that in terms of like demonology and shadow people, and kind of what is your opinion?
Oh, absolutely. So first of all, as you know, with my invocation of the internet, I'm very much into pop culture as a technology for magic. So I think that when it comes to things like the phenomenon of the man with the hat and shadow people, like for one, there definitely are shadow entities. That's what got me interested in hunting for answers as a child. So we experience this. And then when it comes to pop culture and egregores, we can create entities that become the gods and demons and angels of our time through the collective consciousness. So one personal theory I have about this is that there's likely multiple entities, shadow people that have hats. For one, from the work that I do with the dead, I mean, there was lots of periods of time where people wore hats like that. So it's possible that they are experiencing entities from maybe a particular period of time when people in those days were very traumatically inclined in their lifestyle, and like that could be a coincidence of people seeing these similarly types of shadow people, but it also could, in that same vein, be the very same man with a hat that, because the legend grows and is told from person to person, becomes its own actual thing and can exist. There's also interesting other ways of perceiving this, of being like a singularity that goes backwards through time, that's helping us all collectively wake up and gather information about this matrix we exist in through strange collective Mandela effect type memories. So I like to keep a very open mind when it comes to things that I don't know what they are, but those are a couple of theories that I have about them.
One of the questions that we got in the chat was, do Djinn have physical forms or just spiritual forms? They can have animalistic forms, they can have mortal forms, they can be physical, they can be astral, everything in between. What is your take, Orlee, when it comes to demons? Do you think that demons can be something that is physical, or do you think they are more of an astral force?
I have had sexual experiences with demonic entities in an astral form, so not in like tangible physical form, but it was, the sensation of it would be as if it was a physical entity. I do think they can go into people and can manipulate people, and people can be controlled by them. I've had them possess me at times or go within me to try to influence me in some kind of way. I'm very aware of this when it's happening. So it's not something that I allow to have happen to me, but I've experienced it in other people. And so, yeah, I definitely think they can, but in the sense of them being like able to physically incarnate as a person that would be like you or I, if they can, I don't know that they can. Maybe they can. I'm not going to rule it out, because I've experienced things like seeing a person walk down the stairs and go into a room just as if they are flesh and blood, and it was not them, and there was no one there, like after going and looking. So it's hard to say.
Another thing too that I have a question about, I've heard you talk about, witch, but also black magician. So would you say, in your own opinion, is there a perspective between, or not a perspective, but is there like a difference between a black magician and a witch? Like, how would you separate?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a difference of it. I like to use black magician as a phrase to describe myself when I'm basically focusing on the purely demonic perspective of things, I suppose. But I don't really consider myself to be a black magician wholly. I practice all different forms of magic, but when I'm engaging in this type of magic, I would definitely call it being a black magician, because I'm following the archetypes of the formulae.
And you think that is something that is separate, like, than witch?
Yeah, exactly. Like I would say being a witch is more
specific.
Yeah, being a black magician is more specific, because like typically you wouldn't find someone who is a black magician to work with angels, but I do. Mm-hmm. So things like that, yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like witch is kind of like very broad. Like there's
exactly. That's why I like it, because I don't even know. Like my opinion on things could change tomorrow.
Sure.
I mean, yeah, depending on what happens. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I guess what sort of advice would you have for anyone who's watching who might be interested in learning more about demons and working with demons, aside from, of course, checking out your channel, because you do have great content. And I will be linking like all of Orlee's links in the description of this video. So definitely make sure that you go check out all of Orlee's content. It is definitely worth your time. Lots of good stuff there. But so Orlee, what would you say advice-wise that you would give to people who are interested in kind of learning more, or even potentially connecting ritualistically more with demonic energy? Where should they start?
Sure. So I think the first place to start is understanding the concept of fear and why we are afraid of things, which is very much rooted in the unknown. And to understand that to go down this path is a path of overcoming the fear of the dark, overcoming the mysteries of the unknown through your work. And it's not easy. And it's not something that is for everyone. But if you are called to it, it is because you're on a process of overcoming your fear. And very often, everyone who goes into this initially is afraid or will experience fear. But when you allow yourself to learn what it actually is, then you stop being afraid of it. And that's a huge aspect of it. And it's something that will empower you. And a big aspect of this is approaching these entities with respect, but also approaching them carefully, simultaneously. And that's very, very important because these are extremely powerful forces. And there's a reason why the knowledge of how to work with them has been heavily kept hidden from people for so long. And it's because of the incredible power that they have to literally change your reality.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Very beautiful. I think that we are getting close here, unfortunately, to time for our broadcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed having you on my channel, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here and have a conversation with me about demons and Djinn. And like, I would so love to have a part 2 to this, because I feel like there is so much more that I would like to talk about, but we are a little bit under a time constraint because I try to keep my lives between 45 minutes to an hour. So we'll have to talk more off air about that.
Yeah, we'll talk again for sure. This has been really awesome. And it's so cool to see some people that are regular viewers on my channel here in the chat. So I just want to say hi really quick to Star Ruby Corsi, and Scotty Hamilton is here. Hello. And I also see DJ Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Hello as well. To everyone who came over from my channel. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming over and, you know, kind of listening to what I had to say and what Orlee had to say about this topic. I feel like, you know, with watching Orlee's content, it's like there's so much I can relate to with Orlee. And I feel like I said earlier, I feel like Orlee, I'm like on the same street as you. We're walking, you know, on the same street, but in two different directions. And so when we're talking about demons, there's so much of it that I can relate to in working with Satyr or in working with Djinn. And there's some things that aren't necessarily a crossover, but there's so much more crossover, I feel like, between demons and Djinn than people realize. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Coming on and taking the time to talk to me about this. And yeah, we're going to go ahead and end the live. But thank you all also for joining us in this conversation. And hopefully we'll have a part 2. Bye, guys.